I never imagined that terror could infiltrate the life of an ordinary man like me so silently. For many years, I lived a quiet existence in the small city of St. Benedict, a place seemingly forgotten by time, where cobblestone streets and old houses held the stories and secrets of past generations. I had always been a skeptic, a man of science and reason, but the nights that followed forced me to confront horrors that defy any logical explanation. It all began on a cold autumn night. I was walking through the empty streets after a long day's work when I noticed something out of place, a sepulchral silence, broken only by the distant whisper of the wind. The glow of the full moon cast long shadows, and for a brief moment, I felt as if the very buildings were watching my steps with invisible eyes. In the days that followed, the city seemed to change its behavior. Residents who had once casually met in the central square or exchanged laughter on street corners began to avoid any contact. Even the animals, which used to fill the nights with barks and meows, seemed to have been swallowed by a morbid silence. Soon, rumors began to circulate. People had disappeared without a trace, and in the late hours, strange figures wandered the streets. It was on one of those disturbing nights that I encountered the first unmistakable sign that something was terribly wrong. On my way home, I noticed suspicious movement in a dark alley. Curious and I admit a little fearful, I followed the trail of slow, dragging footsteps until I reached an alley where I saw a man, or something resembling a man, with pale skin and empty eyes, wandering aimlessly. When our gazes met, I felt a paralyzing chill run down my spine, as if that being were trying to convey a message of pain and despair. But before I could react, he vanished into the darkness, leaving me with a sense of anguish that seemed to herald a greater evil. The next morning, I sought answers. I turned to the only source of knowledge about the ancient customs of our region, Mrs. Astor, an elderly lady who lived in the house next to the old church. Between trembling sips of black tea, she told me legends that spoke of forgotten rituals and of a curse that had haunted St. Benedict since time immemorial. According to her, in remote times, a secret cult had performed invocation rituals in the local cemetery, attempting to transcend the boundaries of death in order to achieve immortality. What they did not know, however, was that by touching the borders of the unknown, they had awakened dark forces that should never have been disturbed. As the days turned into weeks, the unsettling presence of the undead intensified. The streets, once familiar and welcoming, had now transformed into a nightmare setting. Shadows moving for no apparent reason, whispering voices coming from nowhere, and occasionally the sight of disembodied faces among the mists of early morning. I then decided to investigate thoroughly. Armed with a flashlight, a recorder, and the courage of a man who finds himself cornered, I began to roam the city, searching for clues in the forgotten corners of St. Benedict. It was during one of these investigations that I found an old, dusty diary in an abandoned library. Its yellowed pages recounted disturbing experiences of a former resident who had also been tormented by visions of the walking dead. The diary spoke of a primordial force that fed on fear and despair, and of how the invocation rituals, performed by trembling and ignorant hands, had opened a portal to the beyond. Every word written there seemed to carry the very essence of the terror that now consumed our city. As I read those lines, I felt that I was no longer merely investigating an isolated phenomenon. I was facing a tragic twist, a curse inherited from our ancestors. The neighborhood I knew, with its friendly faces and simple habits, began to reveal signs of moral and spiritual decay. People who had once gathered to celebrate festivals and share joys started living in isolation, as if they feared awakening dormant demons. Old messages left on house doors warned of the presence of restless spirits, and rumors of occult practices resurfaced from the shadows of the past. Neighbors even pleaded with me not to investigate, but the unrest inside me was unbearable. After all, how could it be a coincidence that just when terror began to take hold, the ancestral legends resurfaced with such force? My search led me to the central cemetery, a place of ancient graves and twisted trees that seemed to guard the secrets of those who had passed on. In the dead of night there I was, walking among tombstones weathered by time, when I felt an overwhelming presence. The air seemed to vibrate with a low murmur, almost imperceptible yet laden with infinite sorrow. That was when the dead began to move. It wasn't a coordinated movement, but rather a chaotic dance of condemned souls emerging from the ground as if the very earth were summoning them. In a moment of despair, I was surrounded by translucent figures, their faces distorted into expressions of agony. Their long skeletal hands reached out as if to drag my soul into an endless abyss. The climax of my torment occurred that very night. Attempting to escape the fury of the specters, I ran through dark alleys, but the feeling of being pursued never left me. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and forgotten alleys, seemed to conspire against me. Every step I took was accompanied by the echo of invisible footsteps. When I finally reached the old church, I sought refuge among the shadows of the altar, feeling the proximity of something malevolent that transcended human comprehension. There, in a moment of utter anguish, I heard a whisper, or was it a lament, that told me there was no salvation, that the cycle would repeat itself, and that the dead, once awakened, would never rest. My heart pounded in a frantic rhythm, and reality blurred into my worst nightmares. I don't know exactly how much time passed in that agony. Despair overwhelmed me, and reason seemed to drain away along with the moonlight. As I struggled to find an escape, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man of imposing appearance, cloaked in black robes, with eyes that glittered with an unnatural gleam. He introduced himself as the guardian of the secrets of Saint Benedict, a bearer of years of forbidden knowledge and ancestral practices. According to him, the rituals of the past had opened a door to darkness, and now the city was paying the price for a sin no one dared acknowledge. His words, laden with a dark authority, convinced me that I was facing a truth that defied any rational explanation. The guardian revealed that, in ancient times, our ancestors had forged pacts with entities that dwelled on the threshold between life and death. In exchange for power and protection, they relinquished parts of their soul, and at times, the innocence of their descendants. But such agreements could never be fulfilled without consequences. The forbidden rituals performed under the full moon were desperate attempts to keep alive the flame of a forgotten power. Now, with faith weakened and the memory of ancient rituals nearly lost, the dormant forces found fertile ground to rise again. The guardian warned me, if I wished to save what remained of our city, I would have to confront that power head-on, even though I knew that victory, if it could even be called that, would come at an incalculable cost. With a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, I accepted the mission, fully aware that the confrontation would be inevitable and possibly fatal. The preparations were intense. I gathered information, sought out ancient relics, and with the help of a few who still believed in the legends, devised a plan to contain the curse. However, with every step I took, the feeling of being watched and judged by the very spirits grew stronger. Every corner, every sound seemed an omen that my fate was sealed. On the night of the confrontation, the atmosphere was charged with an almost tangible energy. The moon, shrouded by dense clouds, cast a diffuse light that transformed the shadows into sinister entities. Led by the guardian, I entered an ancient mausoleum located at the far end of the cemetery, a place where once performed rituals were inscribed on cold, damp walls. The air there was thick, laden with the scent of wet earth and decay, and every step echoed like a cry of agony. There, at the heart of that stone labyrinth, I found the epicenter of evil, an altar weathered by time, where remnants of candles and arcane symbols hinted at the performance of a long-forgotten ritual. It was when everything exploded into a cascade of horrors. From the dark corners of the mausoleum, the dead rose in countless numbers, their empty eyes fixed on me, as if they were marionettes controlled by an invisible force. The guardian began chanting in an ancient tongue, and the air filled with a deafening roar, as if the very screams of the underworld were emerging to claim their share. Amid that storm of despair, I felt my will drain away, and for a brief moment, I thought that my fate would be sealed there among the screams of the condemned. I fought with all my might, trying to resist the relentless wave that pushed me into darkness. Every blow I struck, every whispered prayer, was an act of defiance against a power that seemed to have a life of its own. But as the confrontation intensified, I realized that there was something irredeemably fatal about our situation. The dead, Those awakened by the pride and greed of our ancestors were not seeking revenge or justice. They were the reflection of a curse, an inevitability that fed on the very essence of Saint Benedict. In a final act of desperation, the guardian recited an incantation that, according to him, would seal the portal between worlds. I found myself forced to rally every bit of strength in a ritual that combined faith, ancestral knowledge, and a personal sacrifice that could never be undone. As we chanted the sacred words, I felt an increasingly oppressive presence, as if death itself were drawing near to claim its share. And then, in a final moment of pure darkness, the altar exploded in a ghostly light, and the portal began to close. However, the price of that attempt at redemption was far too high. When the light dissipated, the scene before my eyes was one of deadly silence. The mausoleum was empty, except for me and the guardian, who lay exhausted and ruined, as if his very life force had been drained from his body. The feeling of victory was replaced by a profound emptiness, a bitter certainty that, even with the portal sealed, the evil had not been destroyed, but merely contained, like a beast lying in wait for a new moment of weakness. I returned home with my mind in shambles and my heart heavy. The neighborhood of St. Benedict, once full of life and smiles, had transformed into a place of vacant stares and hesitant steps. Many of my neighbors locked themselves in their houses, and the few who still dared venture out seemed to bear the mark of a terror that does not fade with time. Gradually, I began to realize that what we had faced was not an isolated episode, but the beginning of a cycle of horror that would persist as long as the echoes of ancient rituals resonated in the city's collective memory. Today, sitting in a dark room where the only light comes from the flickering of a candle, I feel that the weight of these events has followed me forever. I try to record these experiences in the hope of warning those who in the future might somehow avoid the repetition of this cursed cycle. However, the irony is cruel. The more I try to forget, the closer the shadow of the dead comes, reminding me that the boundary between life and death is far too thin to be ignored. Every nighttime noise, every distant sound, brings me back to that fateful night. The faces of the condemned haunt my dreams, and the feeling of being constantly watched is a perpetual reminder that humanity, in its arrogance, dared to play with forces it could never control. Gradually, I isolated myself, distancing from the few remaining friends and neighbors, for the terror I feel is so profound that the mere presence of another human being becomes a reminder of the fragility of existence. If I still remain among the living today, it is only as a specter of myself, forever marked by the encounter with the beyond. The city of St. Benedict continues its course, but it carries with it the scar of a dark secret, a past that refuses to be buried. And I have become the unwilling guardian of this story, doomed to live with the weight of a truth that few would dare comprehend. Thus, with a heart in tears and a soul darkened by suffering, I conclude this account, aware that somewhere in the shadows of every street and in every whisper of the wind, the dead await the moment of their return, ready to rekindle the terror they once awakened. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.